didn't
Afternoon.
pack for very warm weather. I packed for lots of mid-season.
I packed for warm weather.
I'm going to leave the introductions and just make an acknowledgement of the land we're on. ACMI acknowledges the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we meet, share and work. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from all nations of this land. Thanks.
Hi everybody, welcome to, hello, am I on?
Nothing's happening.
There we're on. Hi everybody, welcome to the ACMI Spotlight on Trina Robbins. If you were in the panel previous to this one, you've met me before. Hello, for those who are fresh in for this panel. I'm Nicola Scott. I'm an Australian comic book artist that works in the international medium, and it's my absolute privilege and honour to be in conversation with one of my heroes, Trina Robbins. Please welcome her, everybody.
Nicola, I love you.
Thank you so much. That makes me very happy. Warms my heart. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Trina's body of work, put your seatbelts on. You're about to become her biggest fan. Trina has been throughout the last few decades the most influential and powerful voice for women in comics. She is, if nothing else, a lady of first. She was... Let's go through the list. She created the first all-female anthology, It Ain't Me, Babe. How cool is that? She had the first openly lesbian character in Sandy Comes Out. After nearly 50 years after Wonder Woman's creation, Trina became the first woman to draw Wonder Woman officially. She co-founded Friends of Lulu. And for those who are Joni Mitchell fans, the song Ladies of the Valley has a whole verse of Ladies of the Canyon, has a whole verse dedicated to Trina. So she is one of our industry's legends. So Trina, welcome to Australia and welcome to your Spotlight panel.
Like I said, I love you, Nicola.
You're a sweetheart. So Trina, can you sort of, to give everybody the sort of the beginning picture, can you paint a picture of your childhood? Can you set the scene for us?
Yes. My mother was a school teacher, and when I was 4 years old, she decided I was old enough to read, so she taught me to read. And I took to reading. Boy, did I take to reading. I read everything, and everything included comics. And my parents, those were the days when a lot of people believed that comics were going to turn kids into little juvenile delinquents and were very bad for you. But my parents, because I read everything, and because I obviously was not becoming a little juvenile delinquent, they never minded that I read comics, and they never tried to censor what I was reading.
What kind of comics were you reading?
Well, in the beginning, when my mother was buying me comics, they were like adorable little kids comics that existed in those days and don't exist anymore, like I was a real Raggedy Ann fan. That'll tell you how little I was. And there were Raggedy Ann comics, Raggedy Ann and Andy.
They were big selling comics at the time, were they not?
They were very big selling. And my mother really approved of them because they were done, you know how comics all have caps in the speech balloons? They were done so that they had caps and then small letters. They were done correctly, and my English teacher mother really approved of that. You know?
I bet.
And they didn't end with exclamation points, they ended with periods. But as soon as I was old enough to cross 2 streets, because you had to cross 2 streets to get to the corner candy store that had comics. So once a week, when I got my allowance, I would go to the corner candy store, and he had a spinner rack that said, "Hey Kids Comics," and you would just stand there going through all the comics, deciding what to get, and the store owner, who was very grumpy, would eventually say, "Make your choice, this isn't a library." So, you know, what I got was any comic that had a female character on the cover, but not a female character who was tied up and being rescued by some guy, but a female character who was in control, who was the major character in the comic.
You had some agency. So who were those characters to you? Who were your favorites as a child?
Obviously Wonder Woman was one of them, but there was much more. Look, see, you've got Sheena up there and Jumbo
Love her.
Comics. Because, not that many people know Sheena anymore, but I loved her. I loved her as much as Wonder Woman. She was the queen of the jungle, and she lived in a treehouse with her pet chimpanzee and swung from vines, and I wanted to live in a treehouse with my pet chimpanzee. Can I tell you something interesting?
Would you please?
I got an epiphany. Spain Rodriguez was an underground cartoonist and a friend of mine, and he died very sadly about 2 or 3 years ago. And his wife is a filmmaker, and she has been working on a film about Spain. So she interviewed me, and she said that the male underground cartoonists that she had interviewed, who were all friends of Spain, had talked about, because I brought up Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, and they had talked about how when they were kids, they loved Sheena, but they used to draw her naked. And I was furious. How dare you do that to my Sheena? And she said, did you draw her naked? I said, of course not. I said, I didn't want her to be naked. I wanted to be her.
Yeah.
And I did. I wanted to be her. And I felt that showed the difference between men and women right there.
Yeah, even when they're little boys, they're drawing Sheena naked.
Yes.
Cheeky buggers. So when you were young, did you start making comics then? Were you sort of drawing your own stories?
Yes. Because I was always drawing. And my mother, the school teacher, used to bring home reams of Board of Education paper, 8.5 by 11 white paper, and also lots and lots of number 2 pencils.
That's convenient.
The first thing I usually did was chew the erasers off the pencils, and then I would take the paper and I'd fold it in half, and you have 4 pages.
Perfect.
And I would just start at the beginning and end up at the end. I didn't know about, penciling. Well, everything was pencil. I didn't know about, using a ruler for panels or any of that, but I would just draw.
And were you making up your own characters, or were you writing stories for characters that you had read from the comics?
I made up my own characters.
Oh, go you. See, that's exciting. What, can you remember any of those characters now?
Well, one of them was a jungle girl, because I really liked Sheena. Then I also made up stories about my own family. They were the funny ones,
Right.
The little girl who gets in trouble and her big sister and her parents.
That's pretty sweet. So did you continue reading comics as you sort of went into adolescence?
I read comics until I went to high school. At 13, I was in high school. And my mother said, well, you're in high school now, and comics are kid stuff. You don't really need to be reading them anymore. And I was such a dutiful daughter. I said, okay. And I gave away my piles of comics, which, thousands of dollars worth of comics, to the neighborhood kids. But it was okay, because at 14, I discovered science fiction.
Oh, yeah, there was a lot of novels, science fiction novels in there.
And they were really, comics and science fiction are so related,
Yeah. In the 50s and 60s. So did you then start drawing like sci-fi stories and sci-fi imagery?
Well, I remember reading the Lord of the Rings and trying to draw the characters, because they were such intriguing, wonderful characters, and all the strong women in Lord of the Rings, trying to draw them.
That's pretty exciting. How did you feel that they were represented in the movies once they came out?
I loved the movies.
Yeah, the movies are fantastic, aren't they? Oh, that's beautiful. So you're sort of building up your own history and your own interests in sort of genre. Did you go to college after high school?
I was a dropout. I did go to college. I went to 2 colleges and dropped out of both.
What were you studying?
Well, the first was Queens College. And because, I wanted to be an artist, but my mother had said, well, but take English courses and take teaching courses. They always be safe.
Right.
Teach. And I did. I didn't teach. I have taught, but, and I loved the English courses, but what really seduced me away from college was hanging out on the campus and singing folk songs with older students who were, because my sister had gone to college first, my big sister, and I kind of inherited her friends. And
that's pretty exciting, a bit risky. So you were then sort of becoming sort of part of the music community. How did that kind of influence your life going into your 20s?
Well, I was a folkie, I loved folk songs, and then along came folk rock, along came Bob Dylan and folk rock, and yeah.
Well, so sort of by the end of the 60s, you're hanging out with a lot of sort of very famous, get ready for this, a lot of sort of big deal famous sort of rock stars.
Yeah, well, at that point, I was living in Los Angeles, and I was married, and we just fell in with the whole Sunset Strip rock and roll crowd. My husband wrote for the LA Free Press, which was one of the first underground papers, and he did an interview with Bob Dylan that you can actually find on the internet.
Wow.
It's a kind of a iconic interview. And, they would come over, and we got into all the clubs free because, we looked good. Yeah. And we also knew we knew all the players, all the musicians, and, they'd come over, and I was like this little hippie housewife. I was sewing, designing clothes, and I would make shirts for the guys, and velvet dresses for their wives and girlfriends, and they'd come over, and I would make pot brownies, and
Awesome. Sounds like a great lifestyle. So by the end of the 60s, you're back in New York, and you had a boutique where you were making your own clothes and selling them in the East Village. This is a boutique called Broccoli. How rock and roll. What took you back to the East Coast?
It was like it was a no-fault divorce. My husband wasn't horrible. He was a really nice guy. But at a certain point, I simply outgrew him.
Right.
And it was time to move on.
Well, good on you for knowing that the time had come.
And, I felt really bad about it. I really felt guilty. But then one day I phoned him, and this teeny bopper who we knew answered the phone, and she was living with him. And I was so happy. I felt so relieved.
All guilt relieved.
Yes.
Yeah. So when you went back to New York, you started working for one of the underground papers there.
This was the heyday of underground papers, the 60s, the middle 60s.
So sort of the beginning of counterculture.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. And I had a friend a writer, Eve Babbitts. She's a pretty well-known writer. And she was the managing editor of the East Village Other, which was the iconic underground Lower East Side newspaper. Evo for short. I'm going to refer to it as Evo because that's what we called it. And I went to visit her, and I met the editor and the publisher, and we all made friends. And that drawing that you've got up there, that's the first one I did. I did it for them. I just did it, because I had met them and I liked them. And I went to the Evo offices, and it was empty. It was locked. Nobody was there. So I slid it under the door, and they published it in Evo, and voila, suddenly there I was, a cartoonist.
That's amazing. So did you know it was going to get published before you saw it in print?
No.
I think that's brilliant. Did they pay you?
Of course not.
Yeah, because it was underground, right? So did that start a sort of longer career, sort of producing more content for them?
Yes. Well, one thing that happened, you can see me, by the way, with my ironed hair and my flag dress in the window of my boutique. And, of course, I did the lettering and the art on the window. Well, one thing that happened was I kind of traded clothes for ads. The Evo crowd would come in, and, like, for instance, that flag dress I'm wearing, well, I made a flag jacket out of the same fabric for Walter Board, who was the editor. And it was like, I made them in trade for doing ads for my boutique. And I did the ads in the form of a comic strip. I called it Broccoli Strip, and it was very psychedelic. You can see my style was very designy.
Beautiful.
At the time. I was very influenced by Aubrey Beardsley. And so I did these ads for my boutique, which they published in trade for getting clothes from me. And the they were ads, but they were also very designy and psychedelic. And most people didn't even know they were ads for my shop. They just thought they were cute little comic strips.
That's pretty sweet. Did they work as advertising, though? Even if they didn't realize they were being advertised to, did they come into your store?
Oh, yes, people would walk. It was a great place. People would just come in. Sometimes they would come in because it was raining and they just happened to be there. And I was down about 4 steps and we would make friends. I made so many friends, people who just walked in. I remember this one woman who came in and she was looking at all my clothes. And then she said, I have some dynamite hash. And I said, okay. And I closed the store and we smoked hash and we became friends.
I want this life. Are you kidding? So in 1970, you moved to San Fran. So you're closing down your boutique.
Yes.
And sort of leaving these relationships that you'd established with Evo and such. So what was it that took you to San Fran?
Well, I was getting more and more into comics,
right,
into underground comics. And all of a sudden in 1968, there was a very small group of underground cartoonists in New York. You could count them on, I think you could count them on your fingers and still have a couple of leftover fingers,
right.
But in 1968, and we were drawing for the newspaper, the underground newspapers. In 1968, I took a trip back to California and went to San Francisco, and at the airport, some friends met me at the airport, and without even saying anything, they handed me a copy of Zap #1.
Right.
And it was like the light bulb went off. It was like, good heavens, it's an underground comic, but it's a comic book. Just like the mainstream comics, just like the superhero comics, it's a comic book. You can do comics in comic books. They don't have to be in underground papers.
Right.
And it was like, it was really bizarre that no one had thought of it before Crumb. It was a revelation. So then, I went back to New York, and there was this publishing company, comic publishing company in San Francisco called the Print Mint. And they had originally started by doing those very famous rock posters. And then they went on to do comics, and they had a comic anthology called Yellow Dog. And I sent them some stuff, and they published it. And it was like,
fantastic.
Wow, you can be in a comic book.
So is that was kind of part of your reasoning for picking up shop and moving to the other coast?
It was really weird, because around 1969 through maybe 1971, all the underground cartoonists from the Lower East Side, it's like we had this kind of lemming-like procession.
Migration.
To San Francisco, stopping short of the ocean,
Right. Don't jump over the cliff. So this is all happening, counterculture has sort of kicked in the 60s. But this is all happening as kind of second wave feminism is really
yes,
kind of,
at the same
you're riding
time.
that wave.
Uh-huh.
So when you get to San Francisco, you started the first sort of women's only anthology with It Ain't Me, Babe.
Yes. Well, what happened was the problem with underground comics was that there was no comics code, and that meant, lack of a comics code meant you could do whatever you wanted. You had absolute freedom, and it turned out that what a lot of these guys wanted were violently misogynistic
Right.
comics that, more than you can possibly conceive of until you've seen some of these things, that depicted rape and torture and murder of women as something funny.
Yikes.
And it kind of started around 1968. Before that, they had been just kind of mild psychedelic hippie things about maybe smoking pot or something.
Right.
And I would go, this isn't funny. And there was only one other woman in San Francisco doing comics. And the guys would say, you feminists have no sense of humor. They didn't even say feminist. That word didn't exist yet. Women's libbers, you women's libbers have no sense of humor. And the result was I wasn't really popular with the guys. They had their own clique and their own boys club, and they would have fabulous parties to which I was not invited. I mean, like Janis Joplin would come, stuff like that, but I never got to go.
Because you were just too politically feminist for them?
Yes.
No fun?
Incorrect as far as they were concerned.
Yeah.
I mean, I can tell you that it came back to me that at least one time when I came into a room with a bunch of guys, that one of them said, "Here comes Trina, hide the knives."
Oh, God. People are the worst. So for those that aren't aware, I think it was in the late 40s or the early 50s, the comics codes kind of kicked in because of, the homoeroticism in Batman and the lesbian overtones in Wonder Woman were sort of seen as...
bad for you.
A bad influence for children. And so that was kind of why all these sort of great adventures that had been happening through the 40s kind of got really dumbed down, and all the characters, all the female characters in particular, all their agency was taken away,
But, some of them really were awful. I don't know if you've ever seen Wortham's book, because he reprints some of these images, and one of them that I remember seeing it when I was 14, and I couldn't get it out of my head. It's like 5 a.m. or something, and this woman is lying there dead, and she's very, the pose, she's dead, but she's very, very...
sexualized.
Yes, and she's wearing an evening gown. And standing over her is the milkman who was delivering milk, and he looks at her and he says, "Geez, a dame," and she's croaked. I've never forgotten that.
Yikes. So how, was it just because it was underground comics that the code didn't apply?
Yes.
How were those comics getting distributed then?
Oh, head shops, of course. We weren't sold at newsstands.
Of course. That's hilarious. So with all of this misogyny kind of happening, I presume you were kind of galvanizing other female creators into putting together this anthology.
Well, what happened was, the guys would invite other guys into their comics, but no one invited me into their comics.
Right.
But the underground newspapers, when I came to town, the word got out, Trina Robbins is in town, and they phoned me and asked me to work for them. Still not exactly a lot of money. It never paid, $20 if you showed up and did some spot illustrations for them. But I wasn't in it for the money, obviously. So I was drawing for the underground newspapers. I have to stress this. It was not the publishers and it was not the underground newspapers that left me out. It was the guys.
It was
themselves.
the guys. It was the community of male creators.
Yeah.
Well, their loss.
Yeah. Then somebody showed me a copy of what was the first feminist underground newspaper in the whole country, which I didn't know at the time. I thought it was maybe the first in the West Coast. It turned out to be the first in the country. And it was called It Ain't Me, Babe. And, we didn't use the term feminist yet. We said women's liberation.
Yeah.
And I saw it, and I went, whoa, this is for me. And I phoned them, and I said, I'd like to work with you. And there was a be-in, I remember, in Golden Gate Park. And we met at the be-in, and we all got along swell. And soon I was like, their artist. I did back covers, I did little spot illustrations, I did front covers. The back covers were very often a continued comic that I did.
Were you writing stories for them as well?
No, I was writing the comics.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. So the longest running anthology, women's anthology that kind of started in 1972 that you co-founded, right?
Yes.
Was Women's Comics. Women's spelled WIMMINS, comics spelled COMIX. So that was sort of the quite political sort of what you would call women's lib comics. What kind of content were you guys creating for that?
Well, we were doing what we wanted to talk about, what we wanted to write, and of course that wound up being things that guys would not write about, they wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, like in the first issue I did the story of my roommate, Sandy, called Sandy Comes Out. It was about how she became a lesbian, and also I think in the first issue was a story called A Teenage Abortion, about a teenage girl who at the time, abortion was still illegal. We were talking about subjects the guys didn't ever want to write about that stuff, you know.
Yeah. Well, they didn't understand
And
it.
I don't think that we were thinking you know, that we were thinking specifically like, oh, I'm making a political statement. We were thinking, this is a story I want to tell.
Right. Well, you guys were intrinsically a political generation,
Yes.
the women in particular,
Yes.
because it was a very heightened political time with sort of, you know, women's lib happening and Vietnam
Yes,
happening.
Vietnam.
It was just inevitable that young people were kind of thrust into quite a sort of political conversation, and therefore you were sort of reacting to the world around you,
Yes.
right?
Oh, definitely.
That's amazing. So that ended up becoming like the longest running anthology
It lasted
series
20 years.
ever, 20 years, which is extraordinary because more often than not, anthologies kind of come and go. You get an issue or two out and then they lose momentum. But for the fact that it kept going for 20 years is quite extraordinary.
Well, we did roughly one issue each year, you know. It's not like we had a monthly or something.
But it's still a lot,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
Anthologies, you know, usually burn out, you know,
Yeah.
even if they do come out once a year. Were you producing work for that book for the whole 20 years?
There were 2 issues that I didn't do. You know,
That's
I
a
don't think
lot.
anyone was in every single issue, but, you know, I was in 18 of them.
That's extraordinary. And so the other women that were sort of producing work for these books, how were they coming to you? How were they sort of finding their way
Well,
to
you have to
your book?
remember, you know, as you said, I was one of the founding mothers. You know, there were 10 of us at the beginning. 10. And when I did It Ain't Me, Babe comics, there was just me and one other woman in San Francisco drawing comics. And I had to find women to contribute. And of course, what I did was I found women who could draw. And I said, hey, how would you like to do a comic? And they went, oh, that's a cool idea, you know, and did their first comics, you know, for It Ain't Me, Babe. But 2 years later, there were 10 of us. That's how quickly it grew.
That's fantastic. And this was sort of still all San Francisco based, right?
Bay Area, San Francisco, Berkeley, yeah.
That's amazing. So somewhere in there, I'm presuming it was when you were still designing clothes, you designed Vampirella's iconic outfit. Is that right?
Oh, that was in the 60s, yeah, when I was still in New York.
When you were still creating fashion. How did that come about?
I visited Jim Warren. He had just started, we didn't even know the name of it was going to be Vampirella. But he had started a new magazine that was going to be kind of his idea of women friendly. You know, I have a major
Right.
a major female character. Right. So I went with my underground comics and showed him my comics, and you know, I was not ready for prime time. I was an underground cartoonist. I wasn't the art he was looking for, but he was letting me down very nicely. You know, rejecting me very sweetly and politely. And he got a phone call, and the phone call was from Frank Frazetta, who was designing Vampirella's first costume.
Right.
And I could tell just from the conversation, Jim Warren didn't like what he had done. I think he had just come up with a little bikini or something. And Jim was trying to explain, no, you know, give her a high collar, you know, like Dracula, and, you know, and so I just sketched it while he was talking and, you know, on a piece of scrap paper and showed it to him. And he said, just a minute, there's a young lady here who knows exactly what I mean. And he put me on the phone and I described the costume to Frank Frazetta. And that was it. That was the costume. And in return, Jim gave me a lifetime subscription to Vampirella, but it kind of petered out.
So when you finally saw Frank Frazetta's interpretation of what you described over the phone, did it represent what you had designed?
Well, it was a little briefer.
Right, of course, because he's a guy and can't help himself. And also he's used to drawing sort of naked ladies.
Yes,
He doesn't want
course.
to cover her up too
Oh,
much.
yeah.
For anyone that's not familiar, I'm sure you can picture it in your head. This costume is iconic and has stayed around since then, despite sort of occasional initiatives to update it or whatever. That 5 years ago, I got to redesign Vampirella.
You did?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, my
and I got
God.
to, I sort of redesigned her as a little bit more biker rock and roll outfit. She had a bit of a jacket and she had some little shorts and sort of trying to keep it sexy but cover her up because it was a little more political.
You know, in the ones from the 60s, she would cover herself up. She had this leopard mini coat that she
That was
wore over her
beautiful,
costumes.
yeah.
I loved it.
I know, I wanted it. But yes, of course, mine didn't last the distance, as have none of the others that have been created. So for yours to have lasted all these decades and will continue to be Vampirella's iconic outfit, that regardless of what fashions we go through, she's always going to revert back to. That's quite a major sort of milestone, I think. That's a major achievement. I think that's really exciting. So there was kind of sort of getting into the 70s, because it was sort of a generally heightened political period, there was sort of politics kind of seeping into mainstream comics as well.
Yes.
Were you still reading mainstream comics at this point?
Off and on.
What kind of things were you sort of gravitating towards?
I think I was really mostly reading undergrounds, but every now and then I would pick up a mainstream comics, and I have to say that in those days I thought they were pretty lame.
Well, yeah, we sort of had characters that sort of had political potential, kind of like Green Arrow and such, sort of activist characters.
Well, I'm going to say things that will get me deported, but, you know, that cover, and it's become an iconic cover. They show it all the time. The one that Neil Adams drew, the Green Arrow one.
Yeah.
Or was it Green Lantern?
I think it was a crossover between the two, was it not?
Okay. But
yeah, Green Arrow, Green Lantern.
okay. But it shows this black guy, and it was supposed to be, you know, really politically cool and advanced, but it was terrible. It was so racist and so insulting and so embarrassing, because this black guy is so wretched. He's so wretched, you know, and he's saying, well, you care about the green people and the purple people, but what about us black people? You know, and it was just, I found it mortifying and embarrassing. And, you know, when they were trying to do stuff like that, for the most part, when they drew black people, they were just, you know, they were always in slums, you know, they were always oppressed.
Yeah.
You know, it took a long time. That's the guy. Look at him. Look at he's a shambling wreck. You know, why not show a positive image?
Yeah, because it was the 70s and America was New York in particular was going through a pretty rough patch. So with these sort of women that you were now surrounded by and you're creating these underground comics together, despite the fact that you weren't reading that much in the way of mainstream, were you seeing any women sort of getting opportunities to participate in the mainstream?
In mainstream comics at those days? No, absolutely not. The only women who worked for the mainstream, for like Marvel and DC, I'm sorry to say, usually were like colorists or maybe letterers, and they were usually married to the cartoonists, and you know, the cartoonists would say, hey, how about hiring my wife? She can letter, you know, she can color. So
were you in any way sort of in contact with the mainstream offices? Like most of them at the time were still on the East Coast.
Oh, they were all on the East Coast, of course. Well, I would go back to New York, you know, to visit and see friends, and I would pop in, you know, to Marvel, not DC so much, but I had friends at Marvel. You know, I was friends with Marie Severin, and Flo Steinberg, who, you know, she just, I don't know how to describe Flo.
The sort of during this time, you created your sort of first sort of work about women in the history of comics. Your sort of first...
That was the 80s.
That was the 80s, going into women in the comics?
Mid-80s was when I started researching women cartoonists, yes.
So can you tell us how women in the comics came about, and what was the format, and how you sort of came to find yourself researching
by the
this?
80s, editors, mainstream editors, were all saying, girls don't read comics. Women never drew comics. And of course, I knew this was bullshit, you know. But so I had to prove it, you know, by researching and finding all these women who had drawn comics and were so good, you know. And it wasn't, I have to stress this, it wasn't like I had to search and finally find a woman who had drawn a comic. It wasn't like that at all. These women had been superstars they had been immensely successful and immensely talented, but they were forgotten because nobody wrote about them. Because when the
Right.
guys wrote histories of comics, they wanted to talk about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and the Hulk, you know?
Right.
And if you're not written about, you are forgotten.
Absolutely. And so that was what drove you to do it. Where were you finding all of your research stuff? And was it a book that you put together or a paper?
Well, the first few were books, and they were done before the internet.
Yeah.
And research was very hard and really very faulty. The first book has a lot of misinformation on it because that's how I found misinformation, you know. I had to rely on, for instance, there was a club in Los Angeles who were fans of early illustrators.
Right.
And so they had written, you know, they would write papers, you know, each one about a different illustrator, and they wrote one on Nell Brinkley. So that was how I found her. But all of their information was wrong. They even got her hair color wrong.
Well, I suppose when there isn't historical information already at hand, they're using whatever anecdotal information
Yes.
they can pull out of the ether.
Yes.
And if that's the only information that you have you? So you've now said that some of that information was misinformation.
Oh, yes.
How have you found? How did you sort of find the realities that sort of clarified
Well,
some
you
of
know,
your mistakes?
It's a little magical how you find these things. For instance, in the case of Nell Brinkley, you know, we have to move forward to the 90s when I got my first computer, you know, the internet, and someone forwarded me an email from a woman who wrote, my mother was a real fan of Nell Brinkley and had lots of things about her, a pile of stuff that is now sitting in my garage since she passed away, and I would like to get this to someone who knows Nell Brinkley. Well, I had written about her, so I answered the email, and I said, I know Nell Brinkley, I've written about her, I would love to have this, but I have to add that I'm a writer, and that means I don't have a lot of money, and I can't really pay you a lot for this. And she answered me and said, I wouldn't dream of asking for money, I just wanted to get to the right person. Okay, now this was the internet, which meant she could have lived anywhere.
Yeah.
She lived about a maybe 40-minute drive from San Francisco, and she drove the stuff over. And it was a pile. Her mother had been really a good archivist, and everything was in plastic sleeves in scrapbooks, really well taken care of.
She was a fan.
That's
amazing.
Listen, she was such a fan, she even did Nell Brinkley's horoscope.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah. And I have to tell you that when writing the book, every now and then I would Althea Lechtler was the name of her mother. Every now and then I would just speak to the ghost of Althea Lechtler and say, Althea, you were right about this.
Oh,
you know,
that's
she
great.
did react that way. You know, it was really...
And just sort of incredibly validating that, you know, not only was there this great female comic creator, but there was this great female fan of this comic creator that was, you know, collecting all of this material and
Just for
archiving
me.
everything so beautifully, well, for you to then share with all of us.
Yes, and now everyone knows.
Yeah, I think that's just beautiful. So this is sort of the beginning of like one of the second stages of your career is sort of building all this, you know, historical information and researching all of these people. But you had your sort of big mainstream moment in the mid-'80s.
Yes.
So was this, this is when Trina became the first woman to draw Wonder Woman. By this stage, Wonder Woman had been around for
41 years.
41 years. This is crazy. Now, was this happening right after Crisis and just before George
Yes.
did
exactly.
his reboot?
Yeah,
right.
so they had 4 months and no Wonder Woman, and gee whiz, what should we do?
So this was something that a 4-issue story that you did with Kurt Busiek.
Yes.
So how did that come about? How did you become the artist for this?
Well,
So
you
how
know,
did you
I
become
have
the
to
first
tell
female
you
artist?
honestly that I don't really know. They simply phoned me. I think it was Alan Gold who phoned me and said, we'd like you to do a 4-issue Wonder Woman. And I said, I'd love it, but I want to draw it in the style of Harry G. Peter, the original artist. And he said, fine. Can you imagine?
That's extraordinary. That out of nowhere comes this phone call.
Well, I actually have in my head, I have a scenario. I have no idea what really happened. But in my scenario, it's a room full of DC editors, very glum, saying, what are we going to do? We have 4 months to fill. And one of them saying, hey, we all know how much Trina likes Wonder Woman. Why don't we just let her do it for 4 months? And even if she screws up, George Perez will come along and fix everything. And another editor saying, that's such a crazy idea, just might work.
Right.
Now, this is not what happened. I have no idea what really happened.
I like that story. I think we should make that fact. So how did you? So were you writing the story with Kurt? Or?
Yes, we co-wrote it. If I could do it today, I would write it. But at the time, I didn't feel competent enough. So
right.
He did the writing, but I came up with a lot of the ideas and things like that.
That's really lovely that your sort of first big mainstream experience could be so collaborative and so supported by editorial, because that's often not the case for people when they get their first opportunities in mainstream, is that you're often having to do the company agenda. So it's really nice that they're saying, we like this sort of retro style and story approach that you're essentially pitching at them, and then getting the opportunity to do that. And has that been republished recently?
Yes, of course.
Which is fantastic.
Yes.
So collected together for the first time since it first came out?
Yes, which is really nice, because it means if you want to read it, you can read it without the little pieces of paper falling apart in your hands.
Right. So for anybody looking, this is called Legends of Wonder Woman.
The Legend of Wonder Woman.
Right. And it's a beautiful piece. Check it out. Only 4 issues. It can't be... It's got to be pretty easy to find. You also got another opportunity sort of at the end of the 80s to revisit Wonder Woman with Colleen Doran, doing the Once and Future story. How did that come about?
Well, again, it kind of amazes me that they went along with it. They couldn't have both been Alan Gold. It was somebody else. I don't remember who it was, but I just proposed this idea. And they went for it. Again, I have my own theories, which is that every now and then DC does come up with a book for a cause, for a good cause.
Right.
And maybe they were due to do a book for a good cause, and I came up with my story about domestic violence, and they thought, that's a good idea. And they went for it.
It was beautiful. I actually own that copy.
Thank you.
I remember
Good.
buying it at the time. Because it was like one of the few Wonder Woman stories that kind of broke through to me, and it felt so different being written and drawn by women. It felt inclusive in a way that I hadn't yet experienced with, the few comics that I had read. So this is it was a graphic novel.
Yes.
That was how it was released as a one shot, right? Was that sort of a much different, because it's quite a big format, instead of sort of working in anthology bites, you're doing quite a big story there. How did you find the sort of creating of that story and weaving it into the Wonder Woman?
It just came naturally. It was a very organic that I should be telling the same story taking place 3,000 years ago and yet still taking place.
Yeah. And was there a reason why you decided not to draw it yourself?
I didn't feel competent enough.
Right.
I mean, oddly enough, I was very competent in doing Harry G. Peters style, but I was not competent enough to do superhero style, and I'm not a superhero artist. And Colleen is so good. My God, she did a beautiful job.
Did you know Colleen at the time?
Yes, we had met ages ago.
Right. Was she your choice, or was that someone that
It was their choice, but it really worked. And both of us are Celtophiles, so that was fun doing Ireland,
Yeah, that's really nice. So in 92, you started up Friends of Lulu. No, 94, sorry. You started up Friends of Lulu.
I was one of the founding mothers.
Right. So can you explain for everybody what Friends of Lulu essentially was, and why you sort of put it together? Why you sort of collectively decided we needed it?
The mid-90s was a terrible time for women in comics. What was the fashion in mainstream comics were bad girl comics, which were, women had never been portrayed in comics in such a sexist, misogynist way. They had huge breasts, tiny waists. They were wearing, like, you know, the most revealing, tiny outfits as possible. You know, and you know, it was really awful. I mean, you had mainstream characters drawn like that. Wonder Woman.
Yeah, Wonder Woman's outfit got real small.
Oh, it was awful. She was drawn by Mike Deodato, a Brazilian artist, and it was horrible. It was horrific and also very violent, very vicious. And there were no women working for comics, you know, really, mainstream comics. And it just got, and the conventions would be awful because there would be all of this bad girl stuff.
Right.
And so at one of the conventions, we just got together for lunch, a group of us, and we said, this is awful. We really need to do something about this. And Heidi MacDonald, who is a comics journalist and a terrific person. I don't know if you ever meet her. She's wonderful. I love her. She put together, she did it really. She's the founding mother, and we were just all the founding stepmothers. At the San Diego Con that year, she put together photocopied announcements that we were, you know, anyone who was interested, we were going to meet at this cafe and talk about what we can do about women in comics, really. And it was, the crowd spilled out onto the street, you know.
Isn't that extraordinary?
Jammed.
Had you been going to San Diego Comic-Con for a while at that point?
Yes, oh yeah.
Can you sort of paint a picture of what it was like sort of through the sort of various decades that you were going?
Well, it was really small in the beginning. My first convention was 1977. Right. And it was so small. It was at the El Cortez Hotel, this rundown hotel. And most of the action really took place at the pool. We just all hung out at the pool. It was great.
Sounds like today, pretty much. So, so by this stage, were you sort of, as you were sort of re-attending Comic-Con and sort of different comic conventions, were there sort of little pockets of female creators? Were you doing panels as sort of a women in comics panel?
Oh, there was always the woman in comics panel, yes.
Right. And did you find that all the women were actually on the panel rather than in the audience, or did you pull a good crowd?
In the very beginning, the women in comics panels were pathetic because there were so few women drawing comics still that a lot of the women would wind up just being somebody's wife. You know, the whole wife thing, I couldn't stand it. I mean, these really, you know, I'm sorry, I hate the wives. They really, you know, they would get the work. They would get, you know, any work that could be done in comics,
they
like lettering and coloring. They were the ones who got it, whether or not they were talented. And sometimes writing, too, you know. The wives got the writing jobs. And they would sit at the conventions. They would sit at their husbands' tables and sell their husbands' art. And I would sit at my own table with my own art, and I didn't have any wife, and God forbid I should have to pee, you know, because I'd have to just leave the table alone.
Yeah, it's interesting that sort of that imbalance of the people who are getting the work and the people who have the agency to create the work on their own. I know which side of the table I'd prefer to be sitting on. So as the years went by, obviously Friends of Lulu was a significant institution prior to sort of social media sort of galvanizing women groups of creators and fans. Friends of Lulu was a really sort of significant part in sort of providing an agenda and a safe space, right?
It was a safe space. It was definitely a safe space. And women's comics was also a safe space.
Yeah. Were you sort of having annual meetings with Friends of Lulu? Can you sort of give us an idea
Well,
of what the sort of running of?
We weren't even just national, we were international. You know,
Yeah.
there were people in England, people all over. So we couldn't exactly have regular meetings because, you know, we were everywhere. But this was the beginning of the internet.
Yeah.
So we could meet, we used to meet, you know, chat, you know.
On the forums.
Yeah,
I remember.
yeah. And we did at a certain point, we didn't have a lot of them, but I think we had 3 or 4 Lulu Cons.
Right.
And in the beginning, they were held as part of the San Diego Con.
Yeah.
And it was cool because we gave awards. We gave Lulus. And at that point, you know, there were the Inkpot Awards, and then there were the Eisner Awards, which really were the, you know, the Oscar of the comics industry. But they always went to men. They always went to men.
Right.
You know, and some of my books were nominated, but they never won.
Yeah.
But I got Lulus from Friends of Lulu for those books and for a comic I was doing. And, you know, without Friends of Lulu, I wouldn't have gotten any awards.
Right.
And not just me, but the other women who got awards.
So it's sort of quite a galvanizing, supportive institution. So Friends of Lulu's kind of existed for a couple of decades, and it's only recently kind of, not really phased out, but just sort of evolved into everyone actually having contact through social media.
It ended around 2008 or 2009, so it lasted a long time.
So sort of over the last couple of decades, you've been sort of building more research into more female creators from history that have been forgotten. Can you tell us sort of what sort of drove you to continue doing that kind of work and some of the women that you've unearthed?
Well, you know, there were these women who were so great and nobody wrote about them and nobody collected their work. So Nell Brinkley was the first, and she was incredible. Her period was 1907 to about 1937. Wow. She died in, I think, 44. And she was so good. I mean, people who look at her work for the first time, they just gasp. This stuff is gorgeous. It's very Art Nouveau. It's exquisite, you know. And nobody knew. Well, she had a little cult following who collected her work, but that was it. Nobody really knew about her, and she was so good. And then, of course, the goddess of women cartoonists had been responsible for me inheriting Althea Lectula's collection. And I, you know, just reading this stuff that Althea had, and, you know, and photocopies that were made of newspaper articles about Nell Brinkley that were so early, such early photocopies that they were reverse. Remember the earliest Xeroxes, white on black.
Well, like a mirror image.
Yeah. And that's what they were, you know, and it was just, all this stuff and, you know, all these insights I got into her. And it was like, well, of course this has to be a book, you know, and that kind of started it. And Tarpe Mills, Miss Fury, and that was amazing because some guys in the 70s at a convention knew about Miss Fury, and they said, hey, you would love Miss Fury. And I said, oh, yeah, I'll have to look into that. And I wound up with, because Miss Fury was a newspaper strip, but it had been reprinted by Timely Comics, which Timely became Marvel. Right. So it had been reprinted in comic form. So the first Miss Furies I found were the comic reprints, and they blew me away. But what I didn't know was that the newspaper strips, the Sunday pages, were so much better because to reprint them in comic form, they had been cut and pasted and, you know, right. And even those were wonderful. But wow, once I saw the newspaper pages, you know, and they're very film noir. It's, you know, we've done a reprint book that I edited, 2 volumes of Miss Fury reprints. If you like film noir, I really recommend the Miss Fury comics.
We'll have to track them down. Can you tell us about what you have coming down the pipeline now?
Aha!
Just last night when we were having dinner, Trina was telling me about this cartoonist.
Gladys
And
Parker.
her work, and it is so beautiful, and she is so beautiful.
I urge you
I am now
all,
obsessed.
after our talk, I urge you to come up here and take these cards. They advertise my next book, which is coming out in 2019. Her name was Gladys Parker. Her period of drawing comics was 1927 to 1965. She died in 66. If you look at the cards, you will see that she happened to look exactly like her character, Mopsy. She also, in the 1930s, she had a clothing line. She was a cartoonist and a dress designer. She had a clothing line throughout the 30s, and she drew her own ads in the newspapers, for the clothes, which I haven't found any other clothing designer who drew their own ads.
Except for you.
Except for me, yes. And of course, they were drawn in her wonderful cartoon style. So what you saw was her cartoon characters wearing these great clothes. And by 1940, she packed up her 2 black cats and moved to Hollywood, where she was where she was making clothes, designing clothes for movie stars, and also was friends with the movie stars. She hung out with the film crowd. And, I could go on, believe me, but, if you can just wait a few months, the book will be out.
She seems to have brought in that sort of androgynous suit-wearing woman look to Hollywood.
She pioneered pants. In 1930, she decided she would only wear pants. And this was a time when very few people, a couple of movie stars got away with it, like Dietrich and Katharine Hepburn, but the average woman would never wear pants outside the house. And she did. She designed, of course, all her own clothes. And they were great. They were great.
I can't wait to read this book, and I can't wait to sort of do my own deep dive research into
My
it.
one tragedy is that she's not with us anymore, because I would have loved to have lunch with her.
I know. So we're now well into third wave feminism, and there is now quite a bit of diversity in comics.
Yes.
How have you been being now one of the elder stateswomen of the industry?
I'm an elder statesman. I love it.
You've certainly been a guiding light for myself, and I think a lot of women of my generation who've been working in comics. There are now a lot of women in comics.
Yes.
And as we were saying in the last panel, when you go to a comic convention, there are more than 50% women there.
Oh, yes.
So how have you found this sort of changed landscape?
Well, there are more women working in comics than ever before. Than ever before. Yeah. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful. God, and the stuff they turn out is so great. They're so talented. And it's opened my mind, because I used to only look for cartoonists who can draw, meaning they know how fingers look. And, you can draw. You're just incredible, But it's opened my mind, because you pick up some of these graphic novels, and they're drawn in styles that I would have rejected, in really bizarre styles. And it's opened my mind to all these different styles. And guys, too. There are men who are doing comics who never would have been able to work for Marvel or DC, because they just don't draw like that.
They just don't draw like that. Yeah, the art's really evolved. So as a lifelong Wonder Woman fan, and as a significant Wonder Woman contributor, we've got to see the ebb and flow of Wonder Woman's sort of popular culture popularity, which sort of ebbed and flowed into quite the tidal wave a couple of years ago.
Yes.
You and I got to go to the premiere of Wonder Woman. How did you find that experience? And what did you think of the movie?
The most glamorous moment of my life. And I loved the movie. I loved it, and I'm sure you did too.
Oh, it was extraordinary.
And the Wonder Woman comics that you drew after that.
Thank you.
Just, as they were like offspring of the film, were wonderful.
I've seen a quote from you talking about a moment that happened in the cinema just as the lights went down, that I have been telling this story as well. So the cinema where the premiere was taking place, the Plantation in LA, is great, big, beautiful, old-fashioned cinema. And the crowd was full of people who'd worked on the movie, lots of comic book creators like Trina and myself, and a whole bunch of others. Lots of women who played Amazons in the movie. You could tell them because they just looked extraordinary.
Oh, God, yeah.
Striding along. It's like, holy smokes, that's amazing. Linda Carter was there, which was a huge one for me. Obviously, Gal and Patty Jenkins, and it was extraordinary. And just as the lights went down, a woman at the back of the theatre yelled out, "I've been waiting my whole life for this!" And the whole audience erupted because we all had collectively been waiting our whole lives to sit down in a darkened cinema and watch a Wonder Woman movie and fall in love with her all over again.
Yes.
And to sort of watch that for the first time, knowing that the world was about to watch it all and either discover her for the first time or rediscover her, was such an exciting moment for someone, for all of us who'd been Wonder Woman fans forever. And I had been saying on a panel just earlier that year, I got to do the Wonder Woman 75th anniversary panel at San Diego Comic-Con with Gal Gadot and Patty Jenkins. And I had said, and Patty kind of chimed in agreement, that 5 years earlier, Wonder Woman just wasn't fashionable. She hadn't been fashionable for a really long time. She'd fallen out of the zeitgeist. And I always felt like it was a real shame because she was such a significant character to me. And I was just hoping that one day people would find her again. And suddenly there she was. And it was Patty that brought her back to us. So very excited about that. So, and you've also had some thoughts on her UN ambassadorship as well. What did you sort of make of that whole situation?
Well, it was kind of too bad. I thought it was great that she became the ambassador, and that was around the same time as the movie, you know. And it was
just before.
She was in her ascendancy, you know. But I think that the women who criticized and said, you know, why are you doing this underdressed woman? I think they didn't really get it. No. You know, and I think that also they weren't seeing, if they had seen Wonder Woman that you drew, I think they wouldn't think that. But they were seeing the Wonder Woman of the 90s, you know, and not just the 90s, you know, periodically, unfortunately, really, because she's just a comic character, she changes depending on who draws her. And so many of the guys have drawn her falling out of her top, you know, and that's what they were seeing, you know.
Even in the sort of 70s second wave feminism, when Wonder Woman kind of came back into herself and was, you know, on the cover of #1 Miss Magazine, thanks to Gloria Steinem, sort of during the 70s, even the TV show that we all sort of have really fond memories of, Linda Carter can't help but being quite a sexual character, quite a sexual creature, because she's so beautiful and she has these sort of Barbie doll proportions that, while it sort of made Wonder Woman that much more glamorous, it kind of also fed into the sort of the childhood psyche of all the boys that ended up drawing her 20 years later with her outfit a little too small and her hair a little too big.
But you know, I don't know any feminist in those years, in the 70s, who didn't love Wonder Woman and watch it.
Exactly. The 70s was a completely different sort of version of feminism. I remember Wonder Woman and Charlie's Angels being, you know, the version of feminism that I grew up with.
The Bionic Woman.
Yeah, and the Bionic Woman. You know, I saw sort of these feminist characters as still really glamorous and beautiful, and I didn't see them as sort of characters that were sexualized for men, even though I'm sure that was kind of part of the making of it, because, you know, it was men running the studios at the time.
But you know what?
But for me, it made such an impression.
Gay men loved her.
Gay men loved her.
Gay men loved her.
Yeah.
Yes. And I wrote something for a comics magazine called the International Journal of Comic Art. I interviewed 6 gay men who were Wonder Woman fans, because you know gay men love Wonder Woman. Yeah. And they all talked about how as kids they watched the show you know, and how much it meant to them. I was at a convention in Argentina, and this guy came up to me, this young man, and he was dressed like Wonder Woman, not in drag, though, because it was starry pants and a top. But he had the tiara and the cape. He looked great, really. And he told me that when he was a 4-year-old child, he had been sexually abused by a neighbor and couldn't fight back. He was 4. And that watching the Wonder Woman show, watching Linda Carter, that gave him strength and support.
Yeah,
I think how much that meant to him.
There's something about Wonder Woman in particular, because she's quite a maternal sort of female energy, quite sort of powerful female energy character, that she sort of becomes your big sister and becomes your mother, and you want to be her as well. That it's very different to that sort of very masculine energy of being able to save yourself or save a situation. And I think that that's possibly part of what sort of the gay men in particular, as well as women, kind of gravitate towards.
Yes.
As well as the fact that she's so glamorous. You know, drag queens would all love to be Wonder Woman.
Well, you know, she's Glinda the Good.
Yeah, exactly. In a spangly outfit. Yes, less pink, more red, white and blue. So we're going to open the audience up to questions. If anyone has a question for Trina, there are roving microphones, so please put your hands up if you'd like to ask any questions. Give us a look, come on.
I can't believe there isn't one arm up. Come on. There now.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about other characters like Sheena from that sort of period and possibly afterwards as well that you really liked, that really influenced you.
Yes, well, I loved Sheena as much as I loved Wonder Woman, and I really did want to live in a treehouse with a chimpanzee. And in fact, you know, I was really a kid, you know, at that point, and my girlfriend Judy got a little disgusted with me because I always wanted to play Sheena, and I always wanted to rescue her from the evil white traders, you know, and she was really sick of being rescued.
Sheena was a character that got a movie treatment in the 80s.
It was terrible.
It was not very good.
Terrible. But you know, in the 50s, there was a TV show, and she was played by an actress, a 6-foot-tall actress named Irish McCalla. And
great name. That can't be real.
Isn't that amazing? What a name. And just like Linda Carter personified Wonder Woman in the 70s, Irish McCalla personified Sheena in the 50s. She really did.
Do you think that there's a way for Sheena to sort of have a similar comeback to Wonder Woman? You know, if given the right treatment, is she a character that can sort of be reinterpreted for a modern audience?
You see. You know, and that movie made in the, when was it done? The 70s, 80s? I think
it was the 80s. It was Tanya Roberts.
It was awful.
Yeah.
It was awful. And you know, in comics, unfortunately, when these characters become public domain, all these independent comics that try doing their own stories, and it's always terrible because they get artists who draw, you know, the characters in, you know, with giant breasts and everything, you know. Luckily, really what saved Wonder Woman is that DC owns her.
Yeah.
So no one can do that, you know, because they'll get sued to, you know, from here to Halifax.
So Sheena is now a public domain character?
I'm afraid so, and it's the same with Miss Fury.
That's interesting.
You could do a wonderful Sheena. You could do a fabulous Sheena. And of course, you know, I would kill to write her, of course, you know.
Well, I'm super interested in discovering Miss Fury as well, because she sounds phenomenal.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I've written about her. She was so film noir that I actually wrote an article about Miss Fury in a film noir magazine.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have to track down and research her, especially if she's public domain as well. That's very exciting. Any more questions? There's one.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about your collaborations and how working with, I guess, your women peers inspired you, and I guess, like, if that created a sense of community for you. when you're kind of being excluded by the men in the industry?
Two different questions, I think. I'll talk about the collaborations because I've had some really good experience collaborating with artists, and I've also had some terrible experience when I didn't get to do any collaboration and the artist just went ahead and did the work. In the 90s, I think it was the 90s, maybe it was the early 20th century, I did briefly, for a few years, did a series with Ann Timmons, an artist named Ann Timmons, and we had made friends originally when she showed me her portfolio at a convention and talked about how, you know, she wanted to draw Star Trek, but they just wouldn't hire her. And I looked at the work, and she was a perfect artist. She was excellent. She could draw everything, but she didn't draw in the house style, you know. She didn't do the forced perspective and all that stuff.
Right.
Because, you know, women really do draw differently than men. She didn't draw like a guy. She drew like a girl. And that's a good thing, you know? So we became friends, and we became email friends. And one day Anne just said to me, why don't we do a comic? You write it, I'll draw it. And I went, whoa, what a good idea. And I came up with a teenage superheroine whose mother had been a superheroine in the 70s. But then when she got married, her husband felt intimidated by having a wife who could fly, so she stopped flying. But of course they divorced because that wasn't going to work anyway. Yeah. But then her memories of being a superheroine, though, she didn't want to talk about it because she had bad feelings about it. But she didn't know that her daughter, her teenage daughter, had inherited her ability to fly. And of course, the daughter becomes a superheroine. The mothers, as a superheroine in the 70s, had been called Go-Go Girl, and the daughter becomes Go-Girl. And it was really a lot of fun working with Anne, and we had a lot of fans, but this was a time when the comic book stores really killed. They really simply killed any comic that was meant for women or that was aimed at women or that was woman-friendly by simply not carrying the books.
Was this sort of in the time of Diamond distribution, kind of monopolizing?
Yes, it was. Yes,
right.
it was.
So was it Diamond or was
No, it was the comic book stores that were owned and run by 30-year-old men who were really 12-year-old boys inside and didn't want any girls in their store. You know, and God forbid they should carry anything with girl cooties.
What a shame.
So distribution, it was bad distribution that killed Go Girl. It was bad distribution in the end that killed women's comics.
Right. Well, that's such a shame because I know that there are still comic stores now that just don't stock a lot in the way of women's stuff.
But there
the
are
ones
so
that
many
do,
good comic stores
yeah, the
now.
ones that do, that have, you know, women working there and women buying there and lots of stuff for everybody.
Or stores that are run by women.
Yeah, they're the best stores. You
Yes.
know, the Valkyries, which is a group of female retailers that have sort of galvanized to make sure that they highlight, you know, creators, female creators and female-driven stories are, you know, fantastic. They've kind of taken over where the Friends of Lulu left off.
Yes, they have. They're wonderful.
Yeah, fantastic. Any other questions? Do we have time? We're out of time.
Oh, no.
Everybody, please put your hands together and thank Trina Robbins so much for coming to see us today.
Thank you. Please take cards.
Yeah, everybody come down and take a card.
I don't want to go
Trina.
home with the cards. I have lots more at home.
And if you want to chat to Trina, we're doing a book signing downstairs on the level below, near where the bookstore is, where the registration desk was today. And some of our panelists from the Australian Comics panel will also be doing some signings there. And for anyone who's at the conference or coming out to the conference meal, it's 8:30 despite what you may have said. So we'll see you there at 8:30.
Thank
you.